Thomas Reed always said that debt was the sound of a weak character. He didn't just avoid loans, he preached against them like a fire and brimstone pastor railing against sin. He built his entire empire, which was substantial, covering everything from logistics software to regional real estate, on the idea of absolute surgical control. You couldn't control the market, he'd lecture, but you sure as hell could control your liabilities. His discipline was his brand. And if discipline was his brand, then Christmas dinner was the annual shareholders meeting where that brand was celebrated. The Reed estate, nestled deep in the prosperous, manicured suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, was designed to look effortless yet substantial. Tonight, the house was a museum of festive perfection. The lighting was dimmed just so, reflecting off the antique silver and the heavy crystal glasses that lined the mahogany dining table. The air smelled of expensive prime rib, rosemary, and the faintest hint of old money. Thomas sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed, his tie clip catching the light. He looked exactly like the man who had bought this house, paid for it in cash 10 years ago, and never looked back. He surveyed the 22 people gathered, his wife, Sarah, looking serene, his 2 grown children, both successful in fields he had subtly guided them toward, and the collection of in-laws, cousins, and nieces who came every year to bask in the glow of Reed's success. Their presence wasn't just familial, it was testimonial. They were here to confirm that Thomas Reed was the one who had figured it out, the man whose principles actually paid dividends.
He was holding court, explaining to his nephew, a recent college graduate, why buying stock on margin was fundamentally immoral. "It's gambling with borrowed chips, Michael," Thomas stated, his voice calm and resonant. "We are Reeds. We don't chase the quick dollar. We build the fortress. We live debt-free. It's the only true freedom." He felt a deep, almost physical satisfaction as he spoke these words. They were the truth, or at least they were the truth he had maintained for 30 years. The only person not hanging on his every word was his brother-in-law, Evan. Evan sat across the table, quiet as a mouse, nursing a glass of sparkling cider. Evan had been laid off from his manufacturing job back in October, and the strain showed in the tightness around his eyes. He usually had a quick wit, but tonight he was just observing. Thomas found Evan's silence slightly unnerving. It was the silence of a man who had lost his footing and was now judging those still standing. Thomas had his phone, a sleek black rectangle, lying face down next to his bread plate. He never answered calls during dinner. It was another rule, another pillar of his self-control. The world could wait. He had placed it there, deliberately, to show that he was present, yet ready to discard the outside world. But tonight, the phone was not a symbol of control. It was a silent, black box of anxiety. What no one at the table knew, what Thomas had spent the last 8 months meticulously hiding, was that the fortress had a massive crack running right through the foundation. The stable logistics software company had hit a patch of turbulence, and Thomas, refusing to let the public image falter, had doubled down on a risky margin loan, a huge one, to buy up his own falling stock and keep the price buoyant. He had borrowed against the entirety of his personal portfolio, convinced he could stabilize the stock and pay off the loan before anyone was the wiser.
He was wrong. The market had continued to punish the sector, and the collateral on that loan, the very stock he was trying to save, was rapidly losing value. The bank had been calling for 2 weeks. He had ignored them all. He figured they wouldn't dare interrupt Christmas. They were too civilized for that, weren't they? He was just accepting a compliment from his cousin, Martha, on the perfectly roasted potatoes, when it happened. Bzzz. The vibration was muffled by the linen placement, but in the sudden lull of conversation, it was sharp, insistent, and utterly aggressive. Thomas felt a cold wave wash over his stomach. He tried to ignore it, continuing his smile, but he knew the moment the sound stopped, it would only start again. Bzzz. It vibrated again, longer this time, a demanding pulse. Thomas reached out, intending to silence it quickly, a practiced, casual motion that implied it was merely a spam call. He was too slow. As his fingers closed over the phone, the screen lit up, illuminating the underside of his chin with a harsh blue glow. It was just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The name flashed large and clear across the display: Sterling Trust and Mercantile Bank. Thomas snatched the phone, flipping it completely over, but the damage was done. Across the table, Evan, the man who had been watching everything all night, didn't flinch. He didn't gasp or make a sign. He just saw it. Thomas knew he saw it. Their eyes met for a fleeting, terrible instant. Evan's expression was neutral, but in that neutrality, Thomas read absolute, devastating comprehension. It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet, sad knowledge of a man who realized the pedestal was made of clay. Thomas cleared his throat. "Forgive me," he managed, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. "A minor business matter. I must take this."
He stood up, clutching the phone, and walked with unnatural speed toward the double doors of the study, which sat just off the dining room. He didn't want to look rude, so he didn't slam the door shut. He left it barely ajar, hoping the heavy velvet drapes and the thickness of the old house walls would absorb the sound. The dining room went completely silent. 21 people froze mid-chew. Thomas pressed the phone to his ear. "Reed," he snapped, trying to project an air of annoyed authority. The voice on the other end was a woman, calm, professional, and utterly devoid of Christmas cheer. She sounded like polished steel. "Mr. Reed, this is Miss Hayes from Sterling Trust. We have been trying to reach you regarding the collateral review of your margin position. As you are aware, your portfolio has dipped below the maintenance threshold." Thomas lowered his voice to a hiss. "Miss Hayes, it is Christmas. I am with family. This is highly unprofessional." "With all due respect, Mr. Reed, your account is in distress. The bank issued a final warning 72 hours ago. We need immediate confirmation of the transfer of funds, $4.2 million, Mr. Reed, to cover the deficiency, or we will be forced to liquidate the remainder of your collateral by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning." The number hit Thomas like a physical blow. $4.2 million. He didn't have $4.2 million in liquid assets that wasn't already tied up in keeping the appearance of solvency. "You can't liquidate," Thomas whispered fiercely. "That's my foundation. That's everything." "It is the collateral for the loan you took out, sir. Immediate payment is required. If we do not receive confirmation within the hour, the process begins." The conversation was brief, brutal, and horrifyingly audible. Even with the door cracked, the human ear is highly attuned to conflict and stress. The dining room was silent, but Thomas knew they were listening.
He heard the faint scrape of silver against porcelain from the dining room, a sound that amplified the tension. He knew the key phrases had carried: $4.2 million, forced to liquidate, collateral. These weren't the words of a man who lived debt-free. These were the words of a man drowning in borrowed chips. Thomas ended the call with a curt, "I understand. I will call you back shortly." He took 3 deep breaths, rubbing his hands together to stop the slight tremor. He had to regain control. He had to walk back in and act as if Miss Hayes had been congratulating him on a successful investment. He smoothed his hair, pulled his shoulders back, and pushed the study door open, stepping back into the warm, scented air of the dining room. The atmosphere had changed entirely. It wasn't loud or confrontational. It was heavy, like the air right before a storm. The caterers, sensing the shift, were moving quickly and silently to clear the main courses. Sarah, his wife, looked at him. Her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes, usually soft and admiring, were now sharp, scrutinizing. She didn't ask what was wrong. She knew better than to challenge the facade in public. Her silence was louder than any accusation. His cousin Martha, however, attempted to break the ice. She was the family's designated diplomat. "Everything all right, Thomas? Hope it wasn't bad news." Thomas offered a practiced, easy smile that felt frozen on his face. "Oh, absolutely fine, Martha. Just a very persistent young broker who thinks he can sell me on a vacation property deal. I had to remind him of my policy against debt. He even chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. Everything is perfectly fine." He sat back down, picking up his fork, but the appetite was gone. He was aware that every movement he made was being judged, analyzed, compared against the words they had just overheard. Evan was still watching him. He hadn't moved a muscle.
The clearing of the plates continued. The caterers were efficient, moving the heavy silver serving dishes onto a large sideboard tucked against the far wall.
That's when Annie, Thomas's 8-year-old niece, the one who loved to help the staff, wandered over to the sideboard. She was small and curious, darting around the adult's legs. Adrenaline. He remembered standing right there during the call, leaning against the wood. Had he dropped something? Annie stood up, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't a holiday card. It was heavy, legal-size stationery. "Uncle Thomas," Annie said, walking back toward the table, her small hands presenting the object like a prize. "It was tucked under the little skirt thing on the table. Is it important mail?" Thomas froze. He recognized the paper stock. It was the package he had received 3 days ago, the one he had ripped open in a panic and then shoved under the nearest piece of furniture, hoping it would simply vanish. As Annie approached, Evan stood up. He walked calmly toward her. Thomas watched the scene unfold in slow motion, unable to move, unable to speak. Evan didn't touch the little girl, but he placed a large, gentle hand on her shoulder and guided her a step closer to Thomas. "Be careful with that, Annie," Evan said softly, his voice measured. He didn't look at Thomas. He looked at the envelope. "Why don't you set that right down next to Uncle Thomas's plate? It looks like he needs to read it." Annie, obediently, laid the envelope down on the linen next to the empty space where Thomas's dessert plate would soon be placed. The envelope was sealed, but the damage wasn't on the front. It was on the back, where the bank had stamped the final desperate plea for attention. The text was in angry, bold red ink, stark against the cream paper.
Final notice. Immediate action required. Failure to comply will result in collateral seizure. The words sat there, undeniable, a physical manifestation of the lie Thomas had just tried to dismiss as a persistent young broker. No one shouted, no one stood up in outrage. The family simply stared at the envelope, then at Thomas. If you're enjoying this story about financial secrets and dangerous appearances, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Thomas could feel the heat rising in his face, but he kept his hands still on the table. To grab the envelope now would confirm everything. The caterer returned, placing a delicate, perfectly caramelized crème brûlée in front of him. Thomas looked down at the dessert, then at the envelope beside it. The richness of the sugar and the brutality of the red ink were a perfect contrast. Sarah finally spoke, her voice low and even. "Well," she said, looking straight at the niece. "That was thoughtful of you, Annie. Thank you for helping your Uncle Thomas with his mail." She didn't mention the words on the envelope. She didn't have to. The conversation that followed was thin, brittle, and entirely forced. A cousin tried to talk about ski conditions in Vermont. Thomas contributed nothing, occasionally nodding, his eyes fixed on the final notice. The pretense of perfection had been shattered not by a scream or a fight, but by a polite phone call, and the innocent hand of an 8-year-old. The chairs began to scrape back from the table much earlier than usual. The tradition was to linger, to sip port, to discuss the year's triumphs. Tonight, everyone suddenly remembered they had early flights, or pets to feed, or a terrible headache coming on. They filed past him, offering subdued, careful goodbyes. No one mentioned the bank, the debt, or the liquidation. They just said, "Merry Christmas, Thomas," their voices strained with pity and the awkward realization that they had just witnessed the public execution of his most cherished principle. Evan was the last to leave the dining room. He paused by Thomas's chair. He still didn't raise his voice. He just leaned in slightly. "I hope things stabilize, Thomas," Evan murmured, his eyes holding Thomas's steady gaze. There was no malice in his voice, only a weary empathy that Thomas found far more humiliating than anger. It's a tough world out there. Sometimes you just lose your footing. Thomas, unable to conjure his usual condescending retort, just nodded stiffly. Then Evan was gone. Thomas was left alone at the head of the long, polished table. The crystal glasses reflected the dying light of the afternoon. He was surrounded by the debris of his perfect Christmas dinner, crumbs, half-empty wine glasses, and the heavy scent of failure. He didn't touch the envelope. He didn't touch the crème brûlée. He just sat there, the millionaire who lived debt-free, his role intact in name only,
waiting for the 9 a.m. deadline that would arrive with the cold light of the morning. He had spent decades building an image of unshakable control, and it had taken one bank call, one innocent niece, and one silent brother-in-law to bring the whole thing crashing down in the middle of Christmas dinner. He finally reached out, not for the phone, but for a piece of the prime rib fat left on his discarded plate. He rubbed the grease between his fingers, the rich, buttery texture grounding him slightly. He was facing a $4.2 million hole, and he had less than 10 hours to plug it. He had to find the money, or tomorrow everything would be gone. The house, the lifestyle, the respect, all of it was tied to the collateral that Sterling Trust was about to seize.
The problem wasn't just the money. The problem was the principle. If he lost everything, he would become what he hated most, a cautionary tale, a man who preached discipline but practiced desperation. He couldn't let Evan be right. He couldn't let the family know the full extent of the lie. He knew Sarah was waiting in the drawing room. She hadn't left the house. She was waiting for him to come clean, to finally admit that the foundation of their life was built on a massive, shaky loan. He needed to find a solution that didn't involve admitting the truth to her or to anyone. He needed a miracle, and he needed it fast. He picked up the phone again, no longer caring if it vibrated loudly. He scrolled through his contacts, past the business partners and the financial advisors. He needed a name that represented leverage, speed, and discretion, a name that was entirely outside the respectable orbit of Sterling Trust and Mercantile Bank. He knew exactly who he had to call, someone he swore he'd never deal with again. He tapped the screen, the dialing tone ringing hollowly in the suddenly silent dining room. He had to keep the collateral from being seized, and that meant making a deal with the devil. But first, he had to face Sarah. The financial fallout was terrifying, but the personal confrontation was going to be worse. Thomas knew that Sarah, the woman who had watched him build his image brick by debt-free brick, was about to tear it all down. He took one last look at the red-stamped envelope, took a shuddering breath, and stood up, leaving the lie lying on the table.
He walked toward the drawing room, toward the true reckoning. The drawing room was where Sarah usually retreated after the main course, a quiet, stately space filled with deep velvet furniture and the comforting crackle of a log fire. It was meant for reflection and gentle conversation. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. Sarah was standing by the mantelpiece, turning a small, decorative silver box over and over in her hands. She didn't look up when Thomas entered. Her posture was rigid, perfectly straight, like a statue carved from ice. Thomas closed the heavy pocket door softly behind him. "Sarah," he began, trying to sound weary but in control. "I apologize for the disruption. It was exactly what I said it was, a persistent broker, nothing more than—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. She finally looked at him. Her eyes weren't filled with tears or rage. They held a deep, profound disappointment that cut him to the bone. "Don't insult me, Thomas. I was sitting 6 feet away. I heard $4.2 million. I heard liquidation, and I saw that red stamp on the envelope Annie brought you." He deflated instantly. The energy he had used to maintain the facade all evening evaporated. He slumped onto a nearby silk armchair. "It's complicated, Sarah. It's a temporary liquidity challenge." "A liquidity challenge," she repeated, slowly setting the silver box down. "You risked everything. You risked this house. You risked our retirement. You risked the children's futures. All for what? To save face for a quarter? To save the company," Thomas snapped, finally finding his voice. "If the stock collapses, the whole structure fails. The company is our name, Sarah. It's the foundation of everything we've built."
"No," she countered, stepping closer. "The foundation of everything we built was the principle you preached, the debt-free life, the control. That was your fortress. You didn't borrow $4 million to save the company. You borrowed it to save the lie." She walked to the large window, pulling back the heavy drapes slightly to look out at the pristine, snow-dusted lawn. "When you started making excuses about why the new kitchen cabinets had to be paid for in 3 separate installments, I started keeping track. When you told me we couldn't afford the usual charity donation this fall, I knew something was wrong. But I never imagined this. A margin call? You, Thomas, who lectured every person in this family about the immorality of margin debt. Her silence was the worst part. She was processing the depth of his hypocrisy, the decades spent living under a flawless image that was, in fact, incredibly fragile. I was going to fix it, Thomas pleaded, standing up. I was going to sell the land parcel in Maine, stabilize the stock, and pay off the margin loan before the end of January. No one would have ever known. Except now Evan knows, Sarah pointed out, turning back to him. And Evan saw the whole thing. He's been quiet all night, watching. He's smart, Thomas. He might be out of a job, but he knows what collateral seizure means. By tomorrow, the entire family will know you are a fraud. The word hung in the air. Fraud. It was a harsher judgment than any bank notice. I need to fix this tonight, Thomas said, his mind racing back to the clock. I have a call to make. I can raise the money. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a cold gesture of skepticism. $4.2 million by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Who do you know who can move that kind of money on Christmas night? Thomas hesitated. He couldn't tell her about Vinnie Moretti. Not yet. Vinnie was the final, shameful secret.
An old associate, Thomas hedged. Someone who deals in specialized short-term financing. High interest, but fast. It will save the collateral. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, reading the evasion in his eyes. She didn't press for the name. She simply walked past him, her hand brushing his arm with a chilling indifference. Do whatever you have to do, Thomas, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. But when this is over, we are going to talk about what's left of our life, and I mean everything. She left the room, the closing of the door echoing the finality of her statement. Thomas was alone again, left with the crushing reality. He had lost Sarah's trust, and now he had to risk his soul to keep the rest of the fortress standing. He retrieved his phone and went into his private office, a bunker of polished wood and leather, shutting the heavy door and locking it. He pulled up the contact, V. The name Vinnie Moretti felt hot and heavy on the screen. Vinnie didn't use a professional office line. The number Thomas had was a burner phone, one Thomas was certain Vinnie replaced every month. The call connected quickly, and a gruff voice answered, thick with a Brooklyn accent. Yeah? Vinnie, it's Thomas Reed. It's been a long time. There was a pause on the line, a sound of cynical amusement. Thomas Reed. Well, well, Merry Christmas to me. I figured you were too busy polishing your gold plates to call an honest working man like myself. What's the emergency, Tommy? Did your gardener quit? Thomas swallowed his pride. Vinnie was sharp and knew exactly who Thomas was, a wealthy hypocrite who needed dirty money. I need $4.2 million, Vinnie, immediately. Wire transfer tonight, before 9 a.m. tomorrow. Vinnie whistled, a low theatrical sound. That's a big stocking stuffer, Tommy, and on Christmas, you must be in a real pickle. Bank trouble? It's a margin call, Sterling Trust. They're seizing my core assets if I don't cover the deficiency.
Ah, the respectable folks, Vinnie chuckled, trying to take down the mighty Reed. I like it. I like it a lot. Okay, $4.2 million, on a night when every bank transfer system is running on fumes and the guys I need to move the paper are drunk on eggnog. This is going to cost you, Tommy. Name your terms, Thomas said flatly. He knew arguing was pointless. Vinnie laid out the terms with the precision of a surgeon. The interest rate was astronomical, 5% above the standard rate, compounded daily, paid back in 60 days. If the 60-day term was missed, the rate jumped again, and Vinnie took possession of the collateral. And the collateral, Tommy? I don't take promises. I need something real, something clean, something I can sell fast if you choke. I hear you got a nice portfolio of regional real estate, the stuff you bought cheap after the last crash. The parcel near Bridgeport? The one with the warehouse? Thomas felt a sickening lurch. That parcel was his safety net, his most liquid, unencumbered asset. Giving Vinnie control of it was like handing over the keys to the kingdom. The Bridgeport property is valued at $6 million, Thomas argued. That's over-collateralization for $4.2 million. Exactly, Vinny said smoothly. It covers the risk of the holiday wire, the high interest, and the inconvenience of me pulling my guys away from their families. You sign over the deed of trust on that Bridgeport property tonight, Thomas. You miss the payment, I own it lock, stock, and barrel. No lawyers, no appeals, just a clean transfer. Do we have a deal? Thomas closed his eyes, visualizing the red stamp on the envelope. Liquidation meant public humiliation and the total destruction of his image. Dealing with Vinny meant private ruin, but it bought him time. Time to sell the stock, time to stabilize the company, time to save face. Deal, Thomas managed, the word tasting like ash.
So what would you do in Thomas's position? Drop a comment below. Is saving face worth any price? Good boy, Vinny said, sounding genuinely pleased. Now listen close. My associate, Rico, is going to meet you. He's got the paperwork all notarized and ready to go. You sign, he makes the call, and the wire goes to Sterling Trust. He'll be there in 45 minutes. Don't be late. And Tommy, don't make me come back for the payment. You won't like my collection agency. The line went dead. Thomas stood there, holding the silent phone. He had just traded one terrible debt for a far more dangerous one. The bank was clinical. Vinny was predatory. He had 40 minutes to prepare for the meeting. He quickly dressed in a heavy coat and scarf. He didn't want the transaction happening inside his pristine home. He needed distance, a buffer between the elegance of Greenwich and the ugliness of this deal. He waited outside, near the service entrance, the cold air biting at his exposed skin. The Christmas lights on the house seemed to mock him, twinkling merrily over the desperation unfolding beneath them. Precisely 45 minutes later, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled up to the curb. It was not the kind of car you saw often in this neighborhood. Two men emerged. One was Rico, a burly man in a worn leather jacket, carrying a thick briefcase. The other, younger and silent, stayed by the car, watching the street. Rico didn't offer a greeting. He simply opened the briefcase on the hood of the car, revealing a stack of legal documents and a battery-powered notary stamp. Vinny says you got a short fuse on this, Rico grunted, his breath clouding in the cold air. Sign here, here, and here. This is the deed of trust for Bridgeport. You sign, the transfer is complete, and we immediately initiate the wire to Sterling Trust. You want to save your ass, you gotta move.
Thomas scanned the documents quickly, though he knew the terms were exactly as Vinny had stated. It was a clean transfer of collateral, legally binding, designed to withstand any challenge. He was handing over $6 million in equity for $4.2 million in debt relief. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket and, using the car hood as a makeshift desk, signed the documents, his signature feeling flimsy and foreign. Rico watched him with impassive eyes. When Thomas finished, Rico didn't even look at the signatures. He simply slapped the notary seal onto the papers, the heavy thwump sounding loud in the quiet night. Done, Rico said. He pulled out a separate phone, not the one Thomas had called, and dialed a number. It's done. Initiate the wire to Sterling Trust, account number B477, $4.2 million. Reference, read repayment. Confirm when locked in. Rico waited, the cold silence punctuated only by the distant sound of Christmas carolers on the next street. After a tense minute, Rico nodded. Confirmed. The transfer is processing. It will hit their account by 7 a.m., well ahead of the 9 a.m. deadline. You're clear with the bank, Tommy. Now you're on the clock with us. He closed the briefcase with a snap. You got 60 days, Rico reminded him, his eyes hard. Vinny's not a bank. He doesn't send letters. He sends people. Don't miss the date. The two men got back into the sedan and drove away as silently as they had arrived. Thomas stood there for a full 5 minutes, shivering, watching the spot where the car had been. He was safe. The $4.2 million hole was plugged. The liquidation was averted. Sterling Trust would be satisfied. But he had mortgaged his future to a loan shark, and he had permanently damaged his relationship with his wife. The image was saved, but the man underneath was broken.
He stumbled back inside, heading straight for the study. He didn't want to see Sarah. He didn't want to explain the smell of cheap cologne and desperation that clung to his coat. He sank into his leather chair, the heavy silence of the house pressing down on him. The time was just past 1 a.m. He had bought 60 days,
60 days to generate $4.2 million, plus the astronomical interest rate, likely close to $5 million total, or Vinny would take the Bridgeport property. Thomas began to work, frantically. He pulled up his spreadsheets, trying to find a legitimate way out. He had to sell stock, but he had to do it delicately so as not to spook the market further. He had to liquidate other minor assets, art, jewelry, maybe the vacation condo in Florida, but selling those things quickly would signal distress to the wider financial world. The problem was, he had already sunk so much into propping up the logistics software company that his liquid reserves were negligible. His entire strategy had been based on the belief that the stock would rebound. It hadn't. He worked through the night, the glow of the computer screen the only light in the cavernous room. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. He couldn't raise the required capital legitimately in 60 days without triggering a massive public collapse of his company's stock price. He looked at the numbers, his head resting in his hands. There was one option left, one final maneuver that he had always considered too risky, too ethically questionable, but now, faced with Vinny's deadline, it seemed like the only path. He had to manipulate the company's Q4 earnings report.
The earnings were due in 3 weeks. If he could temporarily inflate the numbers just enough to create a strong, false narrative of recovery, the stock price would jump. He could then sell his position, pay off Vinny, and buy back the stock later, claiming the initial surge was overblown. It was insider trading, pure and simple, and highly illegal. But if he didn't do it, he lost everything, including the Bridgeport property to Vinny, which would lead to a far messier, possibly violent end. He had access to the raw data. He could adjust the projections, move certain liabilities off balance sheet for a few weeks, and accelerate recognition of future revenue, a classic accounting trick. It was a short-term fix, a desperate gamble on market euphoria. He spent the next 3 hours crafting the false narrative, refining the numbers until they looked plausible, even impressive. He felt a cold, detached professionalism as he did it. The man who lectured on morality was now committing financial fraud to save his reputation. The irony was not lost on him, but the fear of Vinny was stronger than the fear of the SEC. As the sun began to rise, painting the Connecticut sky in pale, icy blues and pinks, Thomas finished his work. The manipulated report was ready. This story's getting more intense, isn't it? Please smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to see it. He scheduled a call with his CFO for 8:30 a.m., claiming an urgent update was needed on the Q4 numbers. At 7:05 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was an email notification. The wire transfer from Vinny's associates had successfully landed in his account at Sterling Trust. Thomas immediately called Ms. Hayes at Sterling Trust. He was careful to use the professional line, not the one Vinny's contact had used. Ms. Hayes, Thomas Reed, I trust you have received the wire transfer, $4.2 million, as requested.
Ms. Hayes sounded noticeably relieved, her polished steel tone softening slightly. Yes, Mr. Reed, the funds are confirmed. We are marking the margin call as satisfied, and your collateral is secure. Thank you for resolving this so promptly. Of course, Thomas said smoothly, injecting a note of annoyed superiority into his voice. I told you, it was merely a temporary oversight. Happy holidays, Miss Hayes. He hung up, the feeling of relief washing over him, quickly followed by the crushing weight of the new reality. He had saved the day, but only by digging a deeper, darker pit for himself. He went upstairs. The house was slowly waking up. The smell of coffee was replacing the heavy scent of prime rib. He found Sarah in the kitchen. She was drinking coffee, staring out the window, bundled in a thick robe. The bank is satisfied, Thomas stated, leaning against the counter. Sarah turned slowly. Vinny Moretti, she asked, her voice flat. Thomas froze. How did you know that name? Because I'm not an idiot, Thomas, she said, taking a slow sip of coffee. When a man who preaches debt-free living suddenly needs millions on Christmas night, he's not calling his investment banker. He's calling the only person who operates outside the law. My father warned me about men like Vinny when we first got married, back when you were still scrambling. I had no choice, Thomas insisted. They were going to liquidate everything. You always have a choice, Sarah corrected him. You chose to live a lie for 30 years, and you chose to protect that lie with a criminal loan. Sarah's words hit hard, don't they? If you agree that Thomas could have made different choices, leave a like, and subscribe for more stories that make us think about money, power, and consequences. What did he take for collateral? The Bridgeport property? He simply nodded, unable to meet her gaze.
"You've lost everything, Thomas," she said, putting her mug down with a soft clink. "The money is replaceable. The reputation can be rebuilt. But you have lost the integrity you claimed to hold so dear, and that is what I can't forgive." She walked toward the kitchen door. "I'm taking the car and going to stay with my sister for a few days. I need to think about what happens next. Don't call me. Don't try to explain the spreadsheets. Just sit here and think about the principle you abandoned." And just like Evan before her, she left him standing alone in the silent, perfect house. Thomas was now entirely isolated. He had 60 days to commit fraud, manipulate the market, pay off Vinny, and somehow win back his wife. He walked back into the dining room. The caterers had quietly cleaned up, leaving only the long, polished table and the memory of the disaster. He walked to his chair. The thick, cream-colored envelope with the red stamp was gone. Sarah must have taken it. A final, silent reminder. He sat down, not at the head of the table, but halfway down, pulling out his phone. He needed to make the call to his CFO, starting the process of the earnings manipulation. He looked out the window. The world outside was bright, cold, and utterly unforgiving. The perfect Christmas had ended in a perfect catastrophe. He was a millionaire in name, but in reality he was a hostage, held captive by his own image and the ticking clock of Vinnie Moretti. The only way out was to fully embrace the deception he had spent his life pretending to hate. The new game had begun. It wasn't about paying off a bank. It was about survival in a world where principles no longer mattered, only results. And Thomas Reed, the man of surgical control, was about to prove just how far he would go to maintain the illusion of power. He tapped the screen, dialing his CFO, ready to deliver the first lie of his great escape.
The morning after Christmas brought no peace, only a cold, hard deadline. Thomas spent the rest of the holiday week holed up in his office, not celebrating, but digging himself deeper into the hole he had just paid $4.2 million to avoid. He was focused on one thing, the Q4 earnings report, due out in 3 weeks. This was his 60-day window to raise the nearly $5 million needed to pay Vinnie Moretti and reclaim the deed to the Bridgeport property. He used every skill he possessed, not the honest ones he preached, but the dark arts of financial manipulation. He worked with his CFO, a nervous man named David who trusted Thomas implicitly, convincing him that certain long-term contracts should be optimized and that revenue recognition needed to be aggressively interpreted to reflect the company's true value. David was hesitant, citing SEC rules, but Thomas's controlled fury and his reputation as a financial genius eventually wore him down. "This is temporary, David," Thomas assured him, leaning across the massive mahogany desk. "A short-term correction to stabilize the market perception. We will correct the figures in Q1 once the stock has rebounded and we've secured the necessary capital injection." It was all lies. He wasn't planning on a capital injection. He was planning on selling his own stock at the peak of the inflated price. The 3 weeks leading up to the earnings release were excruciating. Thomas barely slept. He ate standing up, fueled by coffee and the fear of Vinnie's collection methods. Sarah remained at her sister's house in Westchester. Her silence was a constant, heavy presence, more damaging than any argument. Thomas knew that if he failed, he lost everything. If he succeeded, he lost Sarah. Finally, the day of the release arrived. Thomas sat alone in his office, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the late January gloom. He had scheduled the announcement for 4 p.m., just after the market closed.
At 4:05 p.m., the press release hit the wire. The numbers were spectacular. They showed a miraculous turnaround in the logistics software sector, far exceeding analyst expectations. The narrative Thomas had crafted spoke of operational efficiencies, aggressive new market penetration, and a stunning return to profitability. The next morning, the market reacted with blinding speed. Thomas watched the ticker on his computer screen, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs he hadn't felt since he was a young man making his first million. His company's stock, which had been languishing at $18 a share before Christmas, opened at $25. By 10 a.m., it had shot past $30, fueled by frenzied buying and massive institutional interest. It was exactly what he needed, the perfect, engineered surge. Thomas didn't hesitate. He instructed his brokers to begin liquidating his core personal holdings in the company. He had to be careful. Selling too much too fast would crash the price and alert the regulators. He sold in small batches, using multiple subsidiaries and offshore accounts, a complex process designed to mask the fact that the company's largest shareholder was dumping his position at the height of the false boom. Over the next 2 weeks, as the stock peaked at $34 a share, Thomas sold off just enough to secure the required $5 million, $4.2 million for the principal, and the rest for Vinny's outrageous interest and fees. He watched his lifetime's work, his controlling stake in the company, shrink, but his immediate liquidity grew. He had succeeded. He had manufactured a fortune out of thin air and saved his collateral. He was a criminal mastermind, and he felt utterly hollow. On the 59th day, Thomas made the second call to Vinny Moretti's number. "Thomas Reed," he announced, his voice steady. "The debt is ready. I'm prepared to pay in full, including interest."
Vinny responded with a low, satisfied laugh. "I knew you had it in you, Tommy. You Reeds are always good for the money, even if you have to burn down the forest to find it." The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon, not at Thomas's estate, but in a small, nondescript office building near the docks in Stamford, a neutral, grim location, far from the manicured lawns of Greenwich. Thomas arrived alone, carrying nothing but a certified bank check made out to a shell corporation Vinny had specified. Rico was there, along with 2 other men who looked like they enjoyed their work a little too much. The office was sparse, smelling of old cigarettes and desperation. Rico took the check, his eyes scanning the numbers. $5,015,000, he read aloud. "Nice and neat. Vinny likes neat." Rico pulled out the original deed of trust for the Bridgeport property, the one Thomas had signed away on Christmas night. He tore it in half, then in quarters, tossing the pieces into a metal wastebasket. "You're clean with us, Thomas," Rico said, his voice void of emotion. "For now." He paused, leaning forward on the chipped wooden desk. "But Vinny told me to remind you of something. You used us once. You know how we work. And we know how you work now. If you ever need speed again, you know who to call. And if you ever try to cross us, we know where to find you. That's the real cost of our service, Tommy. We own a piece of your future." Thomas simply nodded. He understood. He had paid the financial debt, but he had incurred a perpetual moral one. He was now tethered to the underworld he despised. He walked out of the grimy office and into the cold afternoon sun, feeling simultaneously triumphant and defeated. He had saved the collateral, saved his image, and averted the immediate public disgrace. Now, he had to face the consequences of his actions. The first consequence was Sarah.
He drove back to Greenwich. When he arrived, Sarah's car was in the driveway. She was home. She was in the drawing room, sitting on the sofa, bathed in the soft, late afternoon light. She was reading a book, seemingly unperturbed. She looked up when Thomas entered. "Did you pay him?" she asked, not putting the book down. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "The Bridgeport property is secure. The debt is settled." "And how did you raise the $5 million in 60 days, Thomas?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting his. There was no accusation, only a demand for truth. "Did you finally liquidate assets? Did you sell the Florida condo?" "I stabilized the company," Thomas said, trying to use the corporate language he was comfortable with. "The earnings report gave the market confidence. I sold off a percentage of my personal holdings at the peak of the surge." Sarah closed her book slowly, placing it face down on the silk cushion beside her. "You manipulated the Q4 numbers." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I corrected the perception of the market. It was a necessary move to protect our foundation." "It was fraud, Thomas," Sarah said, standing up. "It was a lie you told to millions of people, a lie that will eventually unravel. When the audit comes, when the SEC starts asking questions, what will you do then? Lie bigger?" She walked toward him, stopping just inches away. "You saved the house, Thomas. You saved the bank account. You saved the image of the debt-free millionaire. But you didn't save yourself. You have become exactly what you hate, a fraud who gambles with the truth."
Thomas reached out to take her hand, but she pulled away. "I did it for us, Sarah, for the children, for our life."
"No," she whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of months of silence. "You did it for the fear of Evan seeing your name in the paper. You did it to avoid the shame of admitting you were wrong. You chose a criminal debt over honest vulnerability." She sighed, a sound of deep exhaustion. "I won't leave you now, Thomas. That would be too easy for you. That would let you play the tragic hero who lost his wife because of a business mistake. I'm staying." Thomas felt a flicker of hope. "Sarah, thank you. I promise, I will fix this. I will unwind the—" "No," she cut him off sharply. "I'm staying, but this is no longer a partnership. I cannot trust you with the truth, and I cannot respect the man you have become. I will manage my own finances, and I will manage the children's affairs independently. We will maintain the image of the perfect, wealthy, debt-free couple for the world, for the family, and for the sake of the children's careers. But you and I, we are finished. You are the CEO of this household, and I am the silent shareholder. We run the operation, but we don't share a life." It was a sentence worse than divorce. She wasn't leaving him. She was condemning him to live the lie perpetually right beside her. He had won the battle for the collateral, but he had lost the war for his marriage and his integrity. The next time Thomas saw the family was a month later, at a distant cousin's engagement party. The event was held in a sprawling country club, and Thomas arrived with Sarah, impeccably dressed, smiling the same practiced, easy smile. He held court, offering the same sage advice on financial discipline, never mentioning the market surge or the recent stock sales. Everyone complimented him on his company's phenomenal Q4 performance. "Thomas, you are a genius," his cousin Martha gushed. "That turnaround was incredible. Just when everyone else is struggling, you seem to know exactly how to pull rabbits out of hats."
"Discipline, Martha," Thomas said, tapping his temple lightly. "Absolute, surgical control. We don't chase the quick dollar. We build the fortress." Evan was there too. Thomas hadn't seen him since Christmas dinner. Evan was standing by the bar, looking slightly better. He had apparently found a temporary consulting gig. Thomas made his way over, needing to confirm that the lie was holding. "Evan," Thomas said, offering his hand. "Good to see you. How's the job search?" Evan shook his hand firmly. "It's going, Thomas. Glad to hear your company is back on solid footing. That Q4 report was quite the surprise." "We had a few temporary headwinds," Thomas dismissed, waving a hand. "But we corrected the course. Everything is stable. The fortress is secure." Evan looked Thomas directly in the eye, his expression unreadable, showing neither judgment nor empathy, just quiet awareness. "I'm glad to hear the collateral is secure, Thomas," Evan murmured, his voice low enough only for Thomas to hear. "It's always stressful when the bank starts making calls, especially on a holiday." He didn't mention Vinny, or the fraud, or the $5 million repayment. He just reminded Thomas that he knew the truth about the bank call, and that the image Thomas was projecting was utterly false. Evan then raised his glass slightly, a small, knowing salute. "Here's to discipline, Thomas, and to the high cost of maintaining appearances." Thomas forced a smile, but the applause he heard was only the echo of his own conscience. He had bought his way out of disaster, but he had traded financial integrity for criminal leverage, and honest love for a cold, polite performance.
He continued to play the role of the debt-free millionaire, ruling his empire from his perfect home. But now he shared his bed with a woman who despised his dishonesty, and he knew that somewhere Vinnie Moretti was waiting, holding the invisible leash he had willingly accepted. Thomas Reed had saved his fortress, only to find himself trapped inside it forever. Thomas Reed had saved his fortress, only to find himself trapped inside it forever. So, what did you think of this story? Did Thomas deserve this ending? Drop your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. See you in the next video.